In the vast darkness between stars, where ancient civilizations rise and fall like waves against cosmic shores, there exists a truth that even the most powerful beings fear to acknowledge, that sometimes the smallest voice can topple the mightiest throne. For 3,000 years, Emperor Vexthul had ruled over 47 star systems with an iron fist forged in the fires of absolute power. His word was law across countless worlds. His armies were unstoppable. His cruelty was legendary. He had crushed rebellions, exterminated entire species, and carved his name into the very fabric of space itself. But on a small, unremarkable planet in a forgotten corner of the galaxy, something was about to happen that would shake the foundations of his empire. Something that would prove that the universe still held surprises, even for a god emperor who believed he had seen everything. The children he killed thought they were the end of their story. They were wrong. They were just the beginning of his. This is the story of how 5,731 young lives became the catalyst that brought the most feared ruler in galactic history to his knees. This is the story of a single word that changed everything. This is the story of what happens when absolute power meets something it cannot understand, cannot control, and cannot destroy. The universe was about to teach Emperor Vexthul that some things are more powerful than fear, more enduring than empires, and more terrifying than death itself. Humanity was about to show him what hope really means. The throne room of the Eternal Dominion stretched for nearly a kilometer in every direction, its obsidian walls reaching toward a ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. At the center of this vast chamber sat Emperor Vexthul, his form imposing even by the standards of his species. Standing nearly 4 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton gleamed with a dark purple sheen that reflected the dancing flames of 1,000 ceremonial torches. 6 arms extended from his massive torso, each ending in claws that could rend steel, and his compound eyes surveyed his domain with the cold calculation of a predator that had never known defeat. For 3 millennia, Vexthul had ruled the cosmic dominion with absolute authority. 47 star systems bowed to his will. Trillions of beings across hundreds of worlds spoke his name in whispered terror. His empire spanned territory that would take light itself centuries to cross, and yet he was never satisfied. Power, he had learned long ago, was not something to be maintained, but something to be expanded, refined, and demonstrated. The emperor shifted in his throne, a massive construct carved from the bones of the last creature, to challenge his authority openly. That had been nearly 800 years ago, and the memory still brought him pleasure. The Kethmoran dragon had been magnificent in its defiance, breathing plasma that could melt through starship hulls, and roaring challenges that echoed across 3 solar systems. It had taken Vexthul 17 hours of personal combat to bring the beast down, and he had enjoyed every moment of the hunt. "My lord," came a voice from the shadows at the base of the throne. General Crixtal materialized from where he had been standing in perfect stillness, his own exoskeleton bearing the scars of countless battles fought in his emperor's name. "The Veltarian delegation has arrived." Vexthul's mandibles clicked together in what might have been amusement. "Have they indeed? And do they still believe they can negotiate with me?" "They bring tribute, my lord. Vast quantities of their precious crystals, works of art from their master craftsmen, and—" Crixtal paused, his voice dropping lower. "They offer their children as hostages to guarantee their compliance." The emperor's 4 primary eyes focused on his general with laser intensity. "Their children. 5,731 of them, my lord. Ages ranging from what they consider childhood to young adulthood. They believe that by placing their most precious possessions in your hands, they can demonstrate their absolute submission to your will." Vexthul rose from his throne, his massive frame unfolding like some prehistoric nightmare. His footsteps echoed through the chamber as he began to pace, each step measured and deliberate. The Veltarians were a peculiar species, he reflected. Humanoid in basic structure, but covered in scales that shifted color with their emotions. They were known throughout the galaxy for their devotion to their offspring. Their entire culture revolved around the protection and nurturing of their young. For them to offer their children was either the ultimate gesture of submission or the most desperate gambit in their species' history. And What do they want in return for this generous offering? The emperor asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. They request that you spare their homeworld, my lord. They know they cannot resist your expansion into their sector, but they hope to preserve their civilization by demonstrating their willingness to serve. Vexthul stopped pacing and turned to face one of the great windows that lined his throne room. Beyond the transparent aluminum, space stretched out in all directions, filled with the lights of his empire. Somewhere out there, the Veltarian homeworld orbited its ancient star, waiting to learn its fate. The emperor had been planning to conquer it for months, not because he particularly needed their resources, but because their independence represented a small flaw in his perfect dominion. Their territory sat along a trade route he wished to control absolutely, and their neutrality in galactic affairs was beginning to look too much like defiance for his comfort. "Bring me their delegation," he commanded. "I will hear their words myself." The great doors of the throne room groaned open, their movement triggering a cascade of lights that illuminated the chamber in its full terrible glory. The walls were decorated with the weapons and artifacts of conquered civilizations, each one representing a world that had once dared to resist his authority. Banners hung from the ceiling, each bearing the symbol of a different subjugated species, and the floor was inlaid with precious metals taken from the treasuries of fallen empires. The Veltarian delegation entered slowly, their scales rippling through shades of blue and purple that indicated deep anxiety and fear. There were 12 of them, representing what Vexthul assumed were their most important leaders. At their head walked an elderly female whose scales had begun to fade with age, and whose movements spoke of great dignity maintained despite overwhelming terror. They approached to within 50 meters of the throne before stopping and performing what their species considered the most submissive posture possible, pressing their faces to the cold floor and extending their arms in supplication. The gesture was familiar to Vexthul. He had seen it performed by hundreds of species over the millennia. "Rise," he commanded, his voice carrying easily across the vast space. "Speak your piece." The elderly female stood slowly, her scales now showing the deep green that indicated formal address among her people. "Great Emperor Vexthul, ruler of the cosmic dominion, master of 1,000 worlds," she began, her voice steady despite the obvious fear radiating from her companions. "I am Prime Minister Kelanis of the Veltarian Republic. We come before you not to resist your rightful expansion, but to offer ourselves in willing service to your empire." The Emperor's mandibles clicked again, this time in genuine interest. Most species he encountered either groveled pathetically or maintained some pretense of dignity, even in defeat. The Veltarians seemed to be offering something different entirely. "Continue," he said simply. "We know that our military cannot stand against your forces. We know that our technology is inferior to yours, our worlds less wealthy than those you already possess. But we offer something else. We offer absolute loyalty, demonstrated by the most precious gift our people can give." She gestured toward the great doors, and Vexthul watched with growing intrigue as a procession began to enter his throne room. They came in groups of 50 children and young adults of the Veltarian species, their scales showing the rainbow colors of youth and innocence. They moved with the careful precision of those who had been thoroughly instructed in proper behavior, but their eyes held the wide uncertainty of young beings trying to understand why they had been brought to this place of shadows and power. Vexthul counted them as they entered, his mind automatically cataloging details. 5,731, exactly as his general had reported. They ranged in age from what appeared to be perhaps 8 standard years to those on the verge of adulthood. Each wore simple clothing that nevertheless showed the careful attention to detail that marked Veltarian culture, and each carried a small personal item that seemed to provide comfort in their frightening new circumstances. "These are our children," Prime Minister Kelanis continued, her voice now carrying the deeper tones that indicated profound emotion among her species. "We place them in your hands as both tribute and guarantee. Care for them as you see fit, and know that their welfare ensures the absolute loyalty of our entire civilization." The Emperor studied the assembled young beings with the same calculating attention he gave to military formations and resource allocations. They stood in neat rows, their scales cycling through nervous patterns of color, their eyes fixed on the floor in the respectful pose their elders had taught them. A few of the youngest ones were quietly crying, though they made no sound that might disturb the ceremony. Vexthal had seen countless forms of tribute over the centuries. Precious metals, rare technologies, works of art, even the voluntary slavery of entire populations. But this was something different. These beings were offering him not just valuable resources, but the future of their species itself. It was, he had to admit, a gesture of submission so complete that it verged on artistic. "You would trust me with your children?" he asked, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. "You would place the continuation of your genetic line in the hands of one you know to be conqueror and destroyer?" "We know your reputation, great emperor," Kelanice replied carefully. "But we also know your wisdom. A ruler who has maintained power for 3,000 years does not do so through random cruelty. We believe that our children will serve as a bridge between our peoples, and that through them, the Veltarian Republic can find its proper place in your empire." The emperor moved closer to the assembled children, his massive form casting shadows over the front ranks. Up close, he could see the effort it took for them to maintain their composure. Their scales flickered with suppressed emotions, and their breathing was carefully controlled. They had been prepared for this moment, trained in the behaviors that their elders hoped would keep them safe. "And what?" Vexthal asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Makes you think I have any use for 5,000 Veltarian children?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Prime Minister Kelanice's scales shifted to the pale yellow that indicated desperate hope. "They are intelligent, my lord. Quick to learn, eager to serve. They can be molded to whatever purpose you require. Servants, scholars, administrators, even soldiers in time. We offer them not just as hostages, but as a gift of potential itself." Vexthal continued his slow walk along the ranks of children, his compound eyes taking in every detail. They were indeed well-formed specimens of their species, he noted clinically. Their scales showed the healthy luster of proper nutrition and care, their posture spoke of good training and discipline, and their eyes, when they dared to glance up at him, showed the keen intelligence their species was known for throughout the galaxy. He stopped in front of a small female who couldn't have been more than 10 standard years old. Her scales were cycling through the rapid patterns that indicated barely contained terror, but she held her position with remarkable discipline. In her small hands, she clutched a toy of some kind, a small figurine carved from what appeared to be Veltarian crystal. "What is your name, child?" he asked, leaning down so that his massive head was level with hers. "Lyratel, great emperor," she whispered, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. "I am honored to serve you." Vexthal studied the small toy in her hands. It appeared to be carved in the likeness of a Veltarian adult, perhaps her mother or father. The workmanship was exquisite, showing the kind of attention to detail that made Veltarian art valued throughout the galaxy. "A keepsake from home?" he asked. The child nodded, her scales now cycling through the deep blue that indicated profound sadness. "My father made it for me," he said. "He said it would help me remember home while I learned to serve you." The emperor straightened to his full height, his mind working through calculations and possibilities. The Veltarian delegation watched him with barely concealed anxiety, waiting for some sign of his decision. The children remained perfectly still, their training holding them in place despite what must have been overwhelming fear. Vexthal had faced this moment countless times before, the moment when a conquered people offered him everything they possessed in the hope of preserving some small part of their existence. Usually, he took what was useful and discarded the rest. Sentiment was a luxury he could not afford in the business of empire building. But there was something about this situation that gave him pause. Perhaps it was the absolute completeness of their surrender, or the careful way they had prepared their children for this moment. Perhaps it was simply the novelty of a species that understood his nature so clearly that they offered him their most precious possessions without even attempting to negotiate for better terms. He made his decision with the same decisive speed that had made him master of the galaxy. "General Crixtal," he called, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Yes, my lord. Have these children taken to the detention levels. All of them. Now." A wave of barely audible gasps swept through the Veltarian delegation, though they maintained their formal postures. The children themselves showed their distress in the rapid shifting of their scales, patterns of color racing across their skin like living art expressing their fear. "My lord," Prime Minister Kelanis said carefully, "if I may ask, what are your intentions regarding our children?" Vexthul turned to face her fully, his four primary eyes focusing on her with predatory intensity. "My intentions, Prime Minister, are to demonstrate to your people and to the galaxy exactly what submission to my empire means." He gestured to his guards, massive beings in powered armor that made them nearly as large as their emperor. "You have offered me your children as tribute and guarantee of loyalty. I accept your gift. But understand this, they are no longer Veltarian children. They are now property of the cosmic dominion, to be disposed of as I see fit." The emperor began to pace again, his footsteps echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. "You speak of bridges between our peoples, of service and potential, but what you really offer me is leverage. 5,731 reasons why your people will never dare to raise a hand against my authority." He stopped pacing and fixed the delegation with his most intimidating stare. "But leverage is only useful if it is occasionally tested. If those who gave it to you believe that it might actually be used." Prime Minister Kelanis' scales had shifted to the pale white that indicated complete shock. "Great Emperor, surely you do not mean to—" "I mean to show the galaxy that Emperor Vexthul does not accept tribute lightly," he interrupted. "Your children will die. All of them. Today. Their deaths will serve as a message to every world that considers offering me their surrender. That submission to my empire is not a negotiation, but an absolute transformation of existence itself." The chamber erupted in the kind of silence that follows truly devastating news. The Veltarian delegates stood frozen, their scales cycling through colors of grief and horror that Vexthul had rarely seen, even in his extensive experience with conquered peoples. The children themselves seemed not to fully understand what had just been pronounced, but their young instincts told them that something terrible had just occurred. "Take them away," the emperor commanded his guards. "Make it quick, but public. I want broadcasts sent to every world in Veltarian space. Let them see what their gift has purchased them." As the guards began to move among the children, gently but firmly directing them toward the chamber's exits, Vexthul felt the familiar satisfaction that came with decisive action. This would indeed send a message throughout the galaxy. Other species considering surrender would understand that his mercy was not guaranteed, that even the most complete submission might not be enough to preserve what they held most dear. The Veltarian delegation watched in stunned silence as their children were led away. Prime Minister Kelanis seemed to have aged decades in the past few moments, her scales now showing the gray-white patterns that indicated shock so profound it bordered on catatonia. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely audible in the vast chamber. "Why not simply enslave them? Why not use them as you suggested? Why death?" Vexthul considered the question with genuine interest. It was, he realized, a fair question from the perspective of resource management. The children would indeed have been useful in various capacities, and their deaths represented a waste of potential that was somewhat inefficient by the standards of imperial administration. "Because," he said finally, "fear is more valuable than 5,000 slaves. Because the news of this action will reach 100 worlds before tomorrow's dawn, and each of those worlds will understand that Emperor Vexthul cannot be bargained with, cannot be appeased, and cannot be trusted to show mercy even to those who surrender completely." He moved closer to the delegation, his massive presence looming over them like a living shadow. "Your children's deaths will save me the trouble of destroying entire fleets, Prime Minister. Other species will surrender more quickly, more completely, knowing that even perfect submission guarantees them nothing. In the end, their sacrifice will prevent far more suffering than it causes." The emperor turned away from the stunned Veltarians and walked back toward his throne. "You offered me your children as tribute," he called over his shoulder. "I have accepted them as such. You offered them as guarantee of your loyalty. Their deaths will serve as guarantee of my absolute power. You offered them as a bridge between our peoples. Their memory will serve as a bridge to understanding what it truly means to exist in my empire." As he settled back into his bone throne, Vexthul allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The day had provided him with an opportunity to reinforce his reputation, to demonstrate his absolute authority and to send a clear message about the nature of his rule. The Veltarian children would be dead within the hour, and by tomorrow, news of their fate would be spreading through subspace communications across half the galaxy. It was, he reflected, an efficient use of resources and an elegant solution to the problem of maintaining absolute dominion over an empire that spanned the stars themselves. The Emperor did not yet know that in a small, previously unnoticed star system on the very edge of his territory, a young species called humanity had been monitoring these same subspace communications with growing interest and mounting horror. He did not know that among this species, the deliberate killing of children was considered not just evil, but the kind of evil that demanded response regardless of the cost. Most importantly, Emperor Vexthal did not yet know that humanity possessed something that no other species in the galaxy had ever demonstrated: the absolute refusal to accept that any evil, no matter how powerful, was permanent. Admiral Sarah Chun stood on the bridge of the human flagship Indomitable, her weathered face illuminated by the soft blue glow of the holographic displays that surrounded her command station. At 62 years old, she had seen humanity grow from a single-world species to masters of dozens of star systems. But nothing in her 4 decades of military service had prepared her for the transmission they had just received. "Play it again," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that her crew had learned to recognize and respect. The communications officer, a young man named Peters whose hands were visibly shaking, activated the recording for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. The image that appeared in the center of the bridge showed Emperor Vexthal's throne room in all its terrible magnificence, and the voice that filled the space belonged to the cosmic emperor himself. "Let it be known throughout the galaxy," the recording began, "that Emperor Vexthal has received the tribute of the Veltarian Republic. 5,731 children offered in submission have been executed as a demonstration of imperial power. Let all worlds consider this lesson in the true nature of absolute authority." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge of the human flagship in the kind of silence that follows the witnessing of an atrocity so profound that normal conversation seems inadequate to address it. Admiral Chun had built her career on making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. She had commanded human fleets through the border wars against the Centauri Collective, had negotiated the peace treaties that ended the mining conflicts in the Proxima system, and had personally led the evacuation of New Geneva when the star began showing signs of instability. She was known throughout human space as someone who could find solutions where none seemed to exist, who could maintain hope in the darkest circumstances. But the execution of nearly 6,000 children for the crime of being offered as tribute was something that challenged the very foundations of her worldview. "Admiral," said her first officer, Commander James Rodriguez, "we're receiving communications from Earth, Mars, and the outer colonies. They've all received the same transmission." She nodded grimly. The Emperor's message had been broadcast on open channels across dozens of sectors, ensuring that every spacefaring civilization would witness his demonstration of power. It was, she realized, a calculated move designed to terrorize potential enemies into submission before they could even consider resistance. "What's the response from command?" she asked. Rodriguez hesitated, consulting the data pad in his hands. "Mixed, Admiral. The Inner Worlds Council is calling for emergency sessions. Mars is demanding immediate military response. The outer colonies are, well, they're asking questions about whether we should even consider getting involved." Admiral Chun walked to the massive viewing window that dominated the forward section of her bridge. Beyond the transparent aluminum, space stretched out in all directions, filled with stars that represented both opportunity and danger for the human species. Somewhere among those distant lights was the territory of the Cosmic Dominion, and somewhere within that territory was a monster who had just demonstrated his willingness to murder children for the sake of political theater. "Admiral," came another voice from behind her. Chief Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Commander Walsh approached, carrying a data tablet filled with what appeared to be tactical information. "I've been analyzing everything we know about Emperor Vexthal and his empire." Chin turned to face her, noting the grim expression on the intelligence officer's features. Walsh was not easily shaken. She had spent years analyzing threats to human security from across the galaxy. If something had disturbed her professional composure, it was worth immediate attention. What have you found? Emperor Vexthal has been in power for over 3,000 years. Walsh began, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when discussing particularly unpleasant subjects. His empire spans 47 star systems and includes hundreds of subjugated species. His military forces are estimated at over 2 million warships of various classes, supported by ground forces numbering in the billions. She gestured to her tablet, and a holographic representation of the galaxy appeared above the bridge's central display table. Large sections were highlighted in red, representing the territories under imperial control. More importantly, Walsh continued, this is not the first time he has committed acts of this nature. Our intelligence suggests that mass executions, environmental destruction, and cultural genocide are standard tools of imperial policy. The Veltarian children represent just the latest in a pattern of behavior that spans millennia. Admiral Chun studied the display with the focused attention of a career military officer analyzing a potential battlefield. The scope of the Emperor's territory was impressive, but not impossibly vast by the standards of galactic civilization. What was more concerning was the apparent efficiency with which he had maintained control over such a diverse collection of worlds and species. What about his military capabilities? She asked. How do they compare to our own? Commander Rodriguez moved to join the discussion, bringing with him additional tactical data. That's where things get interesting, Admiral. From what we can determine, the Emperor's forces rely heavily on intimidation and overwhelming numerical superiority. Their technology appears to be advanced, but not necessarily superior to our own. He activated another display showing comparative analyses of ship designs and weapon systems. Their vessels are larger than ours, more heavily armored, but also slower and less maneuverable. They seem to favor straightforward tactics based on superior firepower rather than the kind of adaptive strategies we've developed. Admiral Chin absorbed this information with growing interest. Throughout human history, technological superiority had rarely been the deciding factor in conflicts between civilizations. Tactics, morale, and strategic thinking had often proven more important than raw firepower, and it seemed that the Emperor's forces might be vulnerable to the kind of unconventional warfare that humanity had perfected during its expansion into space. What about intelligence on the Emperor himself? She asked Walsh. What kind of being are we dealing with? Emperor Vexthal belongs to a species called the Kithmoran, Walsh replied, calling up biological and psychological profiles. They're arthropod-based, extremely long-lived, and appear to be naturally aggressive. The Emperor personally has been involved in countless battles and is reportedly skilled in both strategic planning and personal combat. She paused, consulting her notes. But, Admiral, there's something else that might be relevant. From what our analysts have determined, the Emperor has never faced an enemy that fought back the way humans do. Shin raised an eyebrow. Explain. Every species the Emperor has conquered has followed predictable patterns, Walsh said. They either surrendered immediately upon seeing his overwhelming force, or they fought conventional defensive wars until their resistance collapsed. None of them ever attempted the kind of asymmetrical warfare that humans specialize in. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. Think about it, Admiral. We've been fighting outnumbered and outgunned since we left Earth. Against the Centauri Collective, against the mineral cartels, even against natural disasters. We've never had the option of relying on superior numbers or technology. We've had to develop creative solutions. Admiral Chun found herself smiling grimly as she contemplated the implications of what her officers were telling her. The Emperor ruled through fear and overwhelming force, tactics that had proven successful against species that fought in conventional ways. But humanity had been forced to develop a very different approach to conflict resolution. Admiral, came a new voice from the communications station. We're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. President Martinez wants to speak with you directly. Chen nodded and moved to her command chair. The holographic display activated, revealing the familiar features of Earth's president, a woman whose own military background had prepared her for the kinds of decisions that civilian leaders were rarely forced to make. Admiral Chen, President Martinez began without preamble. I assume you've seen the Emperor's broadcast. I have, Madam President. My staff and I have been analyzing the tactical implications. then you understand the situation we're facing. A being who rules through terror has just demonstrated his willingness to murder children for political effect. The question is, what are we prepared to do about it? Admiral Chun had been expecting this moment since the first transmission had reached human space. Throughout their history, humans had shown a particular sensitivity to threats against children, a psychological trigger that seemed to override normal considerations of self-preservation and strategic thinking. Madam President, from a purely military perspective, we are significantly outmatched. The Emperor's forces outnumber ours by orders of magnitude, and any direct confrontation would likely result in the destruction of human civilization. And from a human perspective, Admiral, Chen paused, considering her words carefully. The question touched on something deeper than military tactics or strategic planning. It went to the heart of what it meant to be human in a galaxy filled with beings who seemed capable of accepting levels of evil that humanity found intolerable. From a human perspective, Madam President, we cannot allow this to stand unchallenged. President Martinez leaned forward in her chair, her expression showing the kind of determination that had made her a successful leader during humanity's most challenging period of expansion. Admiral, I'm authorizing you to begin planning Operation Moral Imperative. Chun felt a chill run through her at the mention of that particular operation name. Operation Moral Imperative was humanity's contingency plan for dealing with existential threats to galactic civilization, a series of strategies that had been developed but never implemented during their previous conflicts. Madam President, are you certain? The risks are acceptable compared to the alternative of allowing a child-murdering tyrant to continue expanding his territory unchecked. Admiral, I'm not just talking about military action. I'm talking about the kind of comprehensive response that makes it clear to the galaxy that some lines cannot be crossed. The connection terminated, leaving Admiral Chun alone with her thoughts and the weight of impending responsibility. Around her, the bridge crew continued their work with a quiet efficiency that marked professional military personnel, but she could sense their anticipation. Word of the Emperor's atrocity had spread quickly through the fleet, and she knew that every human in space was waiting to see how their leaders would respond. Commander Rodriguez, she said finally, begin preparations for fleet mobilization. I want every available ship ready for operations within 48 hours. Yes, Admiral. Are we talking about a full response? Chen looked back at the holographic display, showing the Emperor's territory highlighted in red across the galaxy. Somewhere in that vast space, a monster sat on a throne made of bones, believing that his demonstration of power had eliminated any possibility of meaningful resistance. Commander sent a message to every ship in the fleet, every colony, every human outpost from here to the edge of explored space. What's the message, Admiral? Chun stood and walked back to the viewing window, looking out at the stars that held both infinite possibility and present danger. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had made a decision that would change the course of history. Tell them that Emperor Vexthal has just learned something that no other being in the galaxy has had to learn before. Tell them he has just discovered what happens when humans decide that something is unacceptable. She turned back to face her crew, and in her eyes was the kind of cold determination that had carried humanity through every crisis they had ever faced. Tell them that the Emperor has just heard the one word that no tyrant in human space has ever been able to ignore. What word is that, Admiral? Rodriguez asked. Chen's smile was sharp as a blade and twice as dangerous. No. Within hours, the first human response began to take shape. Unlike the Emperor's broadcast, it was not transmitted on open channels for all the galaxy to hear. Instead, it moved through the shadow networks that humanity had developed during their expansion, carried by small, fast ships that specialized in avoiding detection while gathering intelligence and delivering messages that were too important for normal communication channels. The message was simple and appeared to be nothing more than standard commercial communication. But embedded within the seemingly innocent data packets were instructions that would reach human operatives scattered throughout the galaxy, including several who had established themselves within the Emperor's own territory under various cover identities. The Emperor had made his move with the kind of dramatic flourish that marked his style of leadership. He had demonstrated his power through an act of stunning cruelty, sent his message to the galaxy with the confident expectation that it would increase his authority and reduce resistance to his expansion. What he did not yet understand was that humanity had received his message and interpreted it very differently than he intended. Where he saw a demonstration of absolute power, humans saw moral clarity. Where he expected increased fear and submission, he had instead triggered the kind of collective response that had made humans dangerous opponents throughout their history. Emperor Vexthul had killed 5,731 children to send a message about the nature of absolute authority. Humanity was about to send him a very different message about the nature of absolute refusal to accept evil as permanent. The war had not yet begun, but the first move in humanity's response was already in motion. Across human space, fleets were beginning to mobilize, intelligence networks were activating, and planning sessions were beginning that would determine whether the most powerful empire in galactic history could survive its first encounter with a one species that had never learned to accept defeat as final. In his distant throne room, Emperor Vexthul sat surrounded by the artifacts of his previous conquests, confident that his latest demonstration of power had secured his authority for centuries to come. He had no way of knowing that somewhere in the void between stars, Admiral Sarachun was looking out at the galaxy and planning the downfall of everything he had built. The word "no" had been spoken, and the universe was about to learn what that word meant when spoken by humanity. 3 weeks after the execution of the Veltarian children, Emperor Vexthul was beginning to realize that something was wrong. It started with small things. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for centuries suddenly experienced equipment failures that caused inexplicable delays. Communication networks across several star systems developed intermittent glitches that seemed to affect only certain types of data transmission. Supply convoys bound for his military installations encountered navigational problems that forced them to take longer routes through less secure territory. Individually, these incidents were mere annoyances, the kind of random technical difficulties that plagued any operation spanning multiple star systems. But collectively, they formed a pattern that was beginning to concern the Emperor's intelligence services. General Krixtal, Vexthul commanded from his throne, his voice echoing through the vast chamber, explained to me why 17 of our supply convoys have experienced technical failures in the past 2 weeks. His most trusted general materialized from the shadows as always, but this time his usual confident bearing was slightly diminished by obvious frustration. "My lord, our investigation teams have found no evidence of sabotage. The failures appear to be genuine equipment malfunctions, navigation errors, and communication breakdowns." Appear to be? The Emperor's mandibles clicked ominously. "Are you suggesting that these incidents are not what they seem?" "I am suggesting, my lord, that the probability of so many unrelated failures occurring in the same time frame is mathematically unlikely. Our statisticians calculate the odds at approximately 4 million to 1 against such a coincidence." Vexthul rose from his throne and began his characteristic pacing, each footstep echoing through the chamber like a countdown to violence. For 3 millennia, he had ruled through a combination of overwhelming force and careful intelligence gathering. His spy networks extended throughout the galaxy. His military forces were positioned to respond to any threat, and his understanding of enemy psychology had proven sufficient to predict and counter every form of resistance he had encountered. "What do our intelligence services report about potential sources of organized opposition?" he asked. General Krixtal consulted a data tablet that seemed insignificantly small in his armored hands. "The Veltarian Republic remains in a state of complete submission following your demonstration. Their government has formally dissolved itself and requested integration into the Empire. The surrounding star systems have all increased their tribute payments and reduced their military forces as requested." "Then who," the Emperor asked with deceptive calm, "is responsible for turning my supply lines into exercises in incompetence?" Before Krixtal could respond, another figure emerged from the shadows near the throne. Intelligence Director Zeph Cole was a member of a different species than the Emperor, a being whose natural camouflage abilities and enhanced sensory organs made her ideal for gathering information that others prefer to keep hidden. "My lord," she said, her voice carrying the subtle harmonics that marked her species' communication style. "We may have identified a new factor in the galactic situation." Vexthal turned to face her fully, his compound eyes focusing with laser intensity. "Explain." "There's a species called humanity that occupies territory on the edge of the galaxy," Zefkol began. "Until recently, they were beneath our notice. Their territory is small, their military forces are limited, and their technology appears to be inferior to our own. And yet you believe they are somehow connected to our current difficulties?" "My lord, our monitoring of galactic communications detected unusual activity following your demonstration with the Veltarian children. The human territory showed increased military mobilization, expanded intelligence gathering, and what appears to be preparation for extended operations." The Emperor stopped pacing and fixed his intelligence director with a stare that had been known to make experienced generals reconsider their career choices. "You are telling me that a species I have never heard of is responding to my demonstration of power by preparing for war?" "Yes, my lord. And, more disturbing, their response does not follow any pattern we have observed before." Vexthal's interest sharpened. Throughout his long reign, he had become expert at reading the psychology of other species. Fear led to submission or desperate resistance. Anger led to poorly planned attacks that were easily countered. Calculation led to attempts at negotiation or alliance building. But all species, in his experience, followed predictable patterns based on rational assessment of their chances for survival. "Show me what you have learned about these humans," he commanded. The chamber's holographic display system activated, filling the space above the throne with images and data about humanity's territory and capabilities. Vexthal studied the information with the focused attention of a predator analyzing potential prey. What he saw was puzzling. Humanity controlled perhaps 30 star systems, a territory that would barely register as a minor sector within his empire. Their population was counted in billions rather than trillions. Their military forces consisted of perhaps 50,000 ships of various classes, a fleet that could be overwhelmed by a single one of his battle groups. "These numbers," he said slowly, "suggest a species that should be seeking accommodation, not preparing for conflict. What could possibly motivate them to risk extinction through opposition to my empire?" "That is where the pattern becomes unusual, my lord," Zefkol replied. "Human psychology appears to be significantly different from other species we have encountered. They have a recorded history of engaging in conflicts where they were drastically outmatched, and often emerging victorious through unconventional tactics." She activated additional displays showing historical data about human conflicts. During their own planetary development, they repeatedly engaged in wars where the outcome seemed predetermined, only to achieve victory through strategies that their enemies had not anticipated. Vexthal examined the data with growing interest. The information showed a species that had indeed fought and won against superior numbers and technology on multiple occasions. But more intriguingly, they seem to have developed these capabilities not in spite of their limitations, but because of them. "They have never had the option of relying on overwhelming force," he mused aloud. "They have been required to develop alternative approaches to conflict resolution." "Precisely, my lord. And their current response to your demonstration suggests that they are applying these same principles on a galactic scale." The Emperor moved closer to the holographic displays, studying the tactical analyses of human military capabilities. Their ships were smaller than his own, more lightly armored, but significantly faster and more maneuverable. Their weapons were less powerful individually, but appear to be designed for coordinated attacks that could overwhelm heavier vessels through superior positioning and timing. "What troubles me," he said after several minutes of analysis, "is not their military capabilities, which are clearly inferior to our own. What troubles me is their apparent inability to recognize this fact." General Krixtal stepped forward. "My lord, perhaps they simply lack sufficient intelligence about our capabilities. Once they understand the true scope of your empire's power, surely they will seek accommodation as all others have done." Vexthal considered this possibility, but something about it felt wrong. The humans had clearly been monitoring galactic communications for some time. They would have access to the same information about his empire that every other species possessed. They knew the scope of his territory, the size of his military forces, and the fate of those who had opposed him in the past. Intelligence Director, he said to Zefkol, what specific actions have humans taken since receiving my broadcast? They have mobilized their entire military fleet, my lord. Not just their border forces or rapid response units, but every available ship, including support vessels and long-range scouts. They have also activated what appears to be an extensive intelligence network that extends far beyond their own territory. She gestured to the displays, which showed the movement patterns of human ships over the past 3 weeks. Most significantly, they have begun what can only be described as harassment operations against our supply lines and communication networks. Vexthal's compound eyes widened slightly as the implications became clear. You believe the humans are responsible for our recent technical difficulties? The correlation is too strong to ignore, my lord. The failures began precisely 72 hours after your broadcast was transmitted. They have affected only systems that are crucial to military operations, and they have occurred in a pattern that maximizes disruption while minimizing the risk of detection. The Emperor felt something he had not experienced in centuries: genuine surprise. Not shock at the audacity of potential enemies, which he had seen before, but surprise at encountering a form of strategic thinking that was completely outside his previous experience. They're not preparing to defend their territory, he realized aloud. They're preparing to attack mine. Yes, my lord. And they're doing so in a way that suggests they understand something about warfare that we do not. Vexthal returned to his throne, his mind working through the implications of this new information. Every species he had conquered had followed predictable patterns: surrender, defensive warfare, or desperate offensive strikes aimed at achieving victory through single decisive battles. None had ever attempted the kind of systematic, long-term campaign of disruption that the humans seemed to be implementing. What, he asked slowly, do we know about human psychology? What motivates a species to engage in conflict they cannot win? Zefkol consulted her data sources, her expression showing the kind of concentration that indicated she was accessing information that challenged her own understanding of galactic civilization. Human psychology appears to be based on concepts that are unusual among spacefaring species, she began. They place extraordinary value on individual life, particularly the lives of their young. They have a concept they call justice that seems to override normal considerations of self-preservation. Justice. The Emperor's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. They seek to bring justice to my empire? More than that, my lord. Human history suggests that they have a psychological compulsion to resist what they perceive as evil, regardless of the personal cost. They appear to be incapable of accepting certain outcomes as permanent, even when resistance seems futile. Vexthal absorbed this information with the growing realization that he was facing something genuinely new in his experience. Fear, he understood. It was a tool he had used to great effect for millennia. Calculation, he understood. Rational beings could be negotiated with or overwhelmed. But a species that was motivated by moral principles rather than survival instincts presented a problem he had never encountered before. General Krixtau, he commanded, increase security around all critical installations. Double the patrols on our supply routes, and implement enhanced screening procedures for all personnel with access to vital systems. Yes, my lord. Are we treating this as a formal military threat? The Emperor considered the question carefully. Every decision he made would ripple outward through his empire, affecting the balance of power that had maintained his authority for 3,000 years. To treat humanity as a serious threat might suggest weakness to other potential enemies, but to ignore them entirely might allow them to cause damage that could destabilize his control. For now, we will treat them as a nuisance requiring management, he decided, but continue monitoring their activities closely. I want to understand their capabilities before determining our response. My lord, Zefkol interjected, there is one more thing you should know about human psychology. Yes, they have a word in their primary language that seems to hold particular significance for their species. Our linguistic analysis suggests that it represents a concept central to their approach to conflict resolution. What word? They call it no, my lord. It appears to represent absolute refusal to accept undesirable outcomes, regardless of the consequences of that refusal. Vexthal found this information interesting from an anthropological perspective, but hardly threatening from a military standpoint. A single word defines their approach to conflict. Our analysis suggests that this word represents something more than simple negation, my lord. For humans, it appears to represent a fundamental principle that some things cannot be accepted, cannot be accommodated, and cannot be allowed to continue. And they have decided that my empire is one of those things? Following your execution of the Veltarian children, yes, my lord. From their perspective, you have crossed a line that requires response regardless of the cost. The emperor leaned back in his throne, considering this new information. A species motivated by principle rather than pragmatism, armed with inferior technology, but superior tactical thinking, and apparently committed to opposing his authority regardless of the logical impossibility of their success. It was, he had to admit, an intriguing challenge. Intelligence Director, he said finally, I want comprehensive files on human history, psychology, and military capabilities. I want to understand exactly what we are dealing with before we decide how to eliminate it. Yes, my lord. And, General, he added, turning to Krixtal, begin preliminary planning for military operations against human territory. Nothing dramatic yet. Simply contingency preparations in case we need to address this problem more directly. As his subordinates moved to carry out his orders, Vexthal found himself looking forward to the coming confrontation with genuine anticipation. For the first time in centuries, he was facing an enemy that promised to be genuinely unpredictable, genuinely challenging. The humans had said no to his empire. Soon, he would have the opportunity to show them exactly how little their refusal meant in the face of absolute power. What the emperor did not yet understand was that humanity had spent its entire history learning how to make their refusal meaningful, how to transform the word no from simple defiance into effective resistance. The harassment operations against his supply lines were just the beginning. Somewhere in the void between stars, Admiral Sarah Chun and her staff were putting the finishing touches on a campaign that would test every assumption the emperor had ever made about the nature of power, authority, and the limits of what was possible when a species decided that some things were worth any price to resist. The emperor had heard the word that would define the coming conflict. Soon, he would learn what that word meant when spoken by humanity with the full force of their collective will behind it. Emperor Vexthal's patience lasted exactly 6 weeks from the moment he first learned of humanity's existence. 6 weeks of watching his supply lines disrupted, his communications intercepted, and his border installations suffer from an endless series of accidents that his engineers could never quite explain or prevent. The final straw came when the humans managed to infiltrate the central computer systems of Outpost Gamma 7, a critical way station that controlled shipping routes through 3-star systems. Instead of stealing military secrets or sabotaging vital systems, they had simply left behind a single message displayed on every screen in the facility. The children you murdered had names. We remember them all. Below the message was a list. 5,731 names in Veltarian script, arranged in neat columns that had somehow replaced every piece of data in the station's computers. The names of every child who had died in the Emperor's demonstration of power, researched and compiled with a thoroughness that spoke of meticulous intelligence, gathering, and absolute determination. Enough, Vexthal declared, his voice carrying across his throne room with the kind of cold fury that made his subordinates grateful for the distance that protocol required them to maintain. General Krixtal, activate Battle Group Omega. I want those systems that humanity calls home reduced to radioactive debris within 1 standard week. Battle Group Omega was the Emperor's personal attack force, a collection of over 300 ships that represented the finest military technology his empire possessed. Each vessel was larger than anything in the human fleet, armed with weapons that could crack planets, and protected by shields that had never been penetrated by enemy fire. The battle group had conquered entire star systems in single engagements, and its reputation alone had convinced dozens of species to surrender rather than face its terrible efficiency. General Krixtal hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. My lord, should we perhaps attempt communication first? Even a demand for surrender. Communication? The Emperor's compound eyes fixed on his general with predatory intensity. They have had 6 weeks to understand the futility of their position. They have chosen to continue their pathetic harassment instead of seeking accommodation. What possible purpose would communication serve? My lord, it has been our standard practice to offer terms before engaging in full-scale military action. It demonstrates the Empire's commitment to order and proper procedure. Vexthal considered this argument while contemplating the tactical situation. His standard approach to conquest did indeed include formal demands for surrender, partly because they often succeeded in avoiding the need for costly military operations, and partly because they demonstrated to the galaxy that his empire preferred order to chaos whenever possible. Very well, he conceded. Send them our standard terms. Immediate and unconditional surrender of all military forces, dissolution of their government, and transfer of all territory to Imperial control. Give them exactly 24 hours to respond. And if they refuse, my lord, then we will demonstrate to the galaxy what happens to species that mistake the patience of empire for weakness. The message that reached Admiral Chun aboard the Indomitable was delivered through the same communication networks that had carried news of the Emperor's atrocity 6 weeks earlier. But this time, the transmission was directed specifically to human territory, carrying the formal seal of the Cosmic Dominion and the unmistakable authority of absolute power. Admiral Chun read the surrender demand in her private quarters, surrounded by the personal effects that had sustained her through 4 decades of military service. Pictures of family members on Earth, awards recognizing her service during humanity's expansion into space, and a small wooden sculpture that her granddaughter had carved for her before her latest deployment. The Emperor's terms were exactly what she had expected. Complete capitulation, the end of human independence, and absorption into an empire built on terror and oppression. The time limit was also predictable. 24 hours was barely enough time for meaningful discussion, let alone the kind of democratic process that humanity preferred for major decisions. But what struck her most about the message was what it didn't contain. There was no recognition that humanity might have legitimate concerns about the Emperor's methods. No acknowledgement that the murder of children might have consequences beyond the immediate intimidation of neighboring species. No indication that Emperor Vexthal understood that some actions created enemies who could not be negotiated with, bought off, or frightened into submission. "Admiral," came a voice from her door. Commander Rodriguez entered carrying a datapad that she recognized as containing tactical updates from the fleet. "Let me guess," she said without looking up from the Emperor's message. "Our scouts have detected Imperial forces moving toward our territory. Battle Group Omega, Admiral. 300 ships, including several super dreadnoughts that outmass our entire fleet. They'll be in position to attack our outer colonies within 72 hours. Admiral Chun set down the surrender demand and walked to the window that looked out on the assembled human fleet. 200 ships of various classes floated in formation against the backdrop of stars, representing everything that humanity could bring to bear against the most powerful empire in galactic history. By any rational calculation, the coming battle would be a massacre. The Imperial forces outnumbered them, outgunned them, and had centuries more experience in large-scale space combat. The logical response to the Emperor's ultimatum would be to seek the best possible terms for surrender, perhaps negotiating for some form of limited autonomy that would preserve human culture, if not human independence. But Admiral Chun had not built her career on following logical responses to impossible situations. "Commander," she said, turning back to Rodriguez, "send a message to Emperor Vexthal. Tell him that humanity has received his terms and wishes to respond." "Are we going to surrender, Admiral?" Chen's smile carried the kind of cold satisfaction that had made her legendary among those who served under her command. "Oh, we're going to respond, Commander. We're going to give him the most comprehensive response in human history." "What should I tell him, Admiral?" "Tell him no." The message that reached Emperor Vexthal was shorter than his own demand by several orders of magnitude. It contained no explanations, no justifications, no attempts at negotiation or compromise. Just a single word in the human language, transmitted on the same formal channels that had carried his ultimatum. "No." Vexthal stared at the message for several long moments, trying to understand how an entire species could reduce their response to 24 hours of ultimatum into a single syllable of defiance. "General Krixtal," he said finally, "are you certain this is their complete response?" "Yes, my lord." Our communication specialists have analyzed the transmission thoroughly. There are no hidden messages, no encoded information, no diplomatic subtleties. They have responded to your ultimatum with a single word of refusal. The Emperor felt something stirring within him that he had not experienced for centuries. Genuine confusion. Every other species in his experience understood that formal ultimatums represented the final opportunity for negotiated settlement. When faced with overwhelming force and certain destruction, rational beings chose survival over principle. They cannot seriously believe they can defeat Battle Group Omega in direct combat, he said, though he was beginning to suspect that human definitions of serious might differ significantly from his own. My lord, Intelligence Director Zeph Cole emerged from the shadows, carrying her usual collection of analysis data. I have additional information about human psychology that may be relevant to understanding their response. Explain. Humans appear to have a cultural concept they call martyrdom, my lord. They actually consider it honorable to die for principles they consider important, and they maintain extensive historical records of individuals who chose death over compromise of their beliefs. Vexthal considered this information with the growing realization that he was dealing with a species whose psychology was fundamentally alien to his own understanding of rational behavior. They would choose extinction over submission. Our analysis suggests that they might, my lord. But, more troubling, they appear to believe that their resistance, even if unsuccessful, will inspire others to similar actions. This possibility had not occurred to the Emperor, but he recognized immediately why it represented a potential threat to long-term imperial stability. His authority depended largely on the universal acceptance that resistance was futile. If humanity's example inspired other species to believe that defiance was possible, the careful balance of terror that maintained his empire could begin to collapse. Then, we will ensure that their resistance serves as an example of the opposite principle, he decided. Battle Group Omega will not simply destroy their military forces. It will eliminate their civilization so completely that no trace remains to inspire anyone. My lord, General Crixtal said carefully, complete extermination of an entire species might provoke negative reactions from other civilizations. There is value in maintaining the perception that the Empire prefers order to chaos. Vexthal waved away this concern with one of his 6 arms. General, I have ruled this empire for 3,000 years by understanding the psychology of power. Excessive mercy is more dangerous than excessive cruelty, because it suggests weakness to potential enemies. He rose from his throne and began pacing, his footsteps echoing through the vast chamber. The humans have made their choice. They have rejected accommodation, spurned negotiation, and chosen defiance over survival. Now, they will serve as an example to the galaxy of what happens to those who mistake my patience for weakness. Yes, my lord. Battle Group Omega reports that it will be in position to begin operations within 18 hours. Excellent. I want the destruction broadcast on all frequencies so that every civilized world can witness the consequences of refusing imperial authority. What Emperor Vexthal did not know was that humanity had spent the past 6 weeks preparing for exactly this scenario. While his attention had been focused on their harassment operations against his supply lines, Admiral Chun and her staff had been implementing a strategy that drew on every lesson their species had learned during its violent but instructive history. The human fleet that Battle Group Omega would encounter when it arrived at the coordinates of human space would not be the pathetic collection of inferior vessels that Imperial intelligence had described. It would be something that no previous enemy of the Empire had ever attempted. A military force that had been designed from the beginning to fight outnumbered, outgunned, and apparently without hope of victory. But, more importantly, it would be a force that understood something about warfare that the Emperor had never encountered before. That sometimes the goal of a battle is not to win, but to demonstrate that certain principles are worth any price to defend. Admiral Chen stood on her bridge as the final preparations for battle were completed, watching her tactical displays show the approach of Imperial forces that represented overwhelming superiority in every measurable category, except the one that mattered most. Admiral, Commander Rodriguez reported, all ships report ready for Operation Defiant Stand. Very well, Commander. Signal the fleet. Message begins. To all ships, this is Admiral Chun. In approximately 12 hours, We will engage forces representing the most powerful empire in galactic history. We are outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy with centuries more experience than our own." She paused, looking around her bridge at the faces of officers who had volunteered for what everyone understood was likely to be a suicide mission. "But we have something that no Imperial force has ever faced before. We have the absolute certainty that what we defend is worth defending, that what we fight against is worth fighting against, and that some principles are more important than survival itself. The Emperor believes that fear is the ultimate weapon. Today, we will show the galaxy what humans do when we are not afraid to die for what we believe in. All ships, prepare for battle. Remember the children. Remember their names. And show the universe what the word no means when spoken by humanity." As the human fleet moved into position for the coming battle, Emperor Vexthal settled back into his throne to watch what he expected would be the swift and total destruction of the most troublesome species he had encountered in centuries. He was about to learn that there was a difference between winning a battle and achieving victory, and that sometimes the most devastating defeats come disguised as overwhelming military success. The Battle of Kepler's Edge lasted exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. By any military standard, it was a complete victory for the forces of the Cosmic Dominion. Battle Group Omega destroyed every human vessel, eliminated all military resistance, and achieved total battlefield supremacy with minimal losses to their own forces. Emperor Vexthal watched the entire engagement from his throne room, the massive holographic displays showing him every detail of humanity's destruction in real time. The human fleet had fought with impressive coordination and tactical skill, but their inferior technology and overwhelming numerical disadvantage had made the outcome inevitable from the moment the first shots were fired. What puzzled the Emperor, however, was the manner of their defeat. The humans had not fled when their position became hopeless. They had not surrendered when their losses became unsustainable. They had not even retreated when tactical withdrawal would have preserved some portion of their forces for future resistance. Instead, they had continued fighting with the same intensity until the very last ship was destroyed, their final transmission consisting of nothing more than the now familiar word that had defined their entire response to Imperial authority. "No, General Krixtau," the Emperor said as the displays showed the debris field that had once been the human fleet. "Are there any survivors?" "No, my lord. The humans appear to have disabled their escape pods rather than allow themselves to be captured. We detected several ships self-destructing rather than surrendering when their tactical situation became hopeless." Vexthal found this information disturbing for reasons he could not entirely identify. Choosing death over capture was not unknown among the species he had conquered, but it was usually limited to military commanders or political leaders who feared punishment for their resistance. The humans appear to have made this choice collectively, as if their entire species preferred extinction to life under Imperial rule. "What about their civilian populations?" he asked. "What is the status of their colonies and homeworld?" Intelligence Director Zeph Cole materialized with her characteristic stealth, but her usual calm demeanor showed signs of strain that immediately caught the Emperor's attention. "My lord, that is where we encounter our first unexpected development." "Explain." "The human colonies appear to have been evacuated, my lord. Not recently, but systematically over the past 6 weeks. Our initial scans suggest that their civilian population centers are empty." Vexthal's compound eyes focused on his intelligence director with laser intensity. "Empty? Where did they go?" "Unknown, my lord. The evacuation was conducted with extraordinary efficiency and appears to have been planned well in advance of our military operations. Ships that our intelligence services had classified as cargo vessels were apparently converted for mass civilian transport." The Emperor felt the stirrings of something he had not experienced in many centuries, the realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood his enemy's capabilities and intentions. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that the humans evacuated their entire civilization while simultaneously conducting military operations against my empire?" "Yes, my lord. And the implications are concerning." Before Zeph Cole could elaborate, a priority communication signal chimed through the throne room's audio systems. General Krixtau moved to the communication station with obvious urgency. "My lord," he reported after a brief exchange with the incoming transmission. "We are receiving reports from across the Empire. There appear to be incidents occurring on multiple worlds." "What kind of incidents?" "Uprisings, my lord. On 17 different worlds, subject populations have begun open rebellion against Imperial authority. They're using tactics and strategies that bear remarkable similarity to those employed by the humans during their harassment operations." Emperor Vexthul felt something he had not experienced for 3 millennia: genuine fear. Not fear of military defeat, which he could counter with superior force, but fear of something far more dangerous to his authority: the collapse of the psychological foundations that held his empire together. "Show me," he commanded. The holographic displays shifted to show incidents occurring across Imperial territory. On Velterra Prime, the Veltarian survivors had somehow acquired weapons and were engaging Imperial garrison forces with coordinated attacks. On the mining world of Kethmore, the slave populations had simultaneously sabotaged extraction operations across an entire continent. On the trading hub of Zephyr Station, civilian populations were refusing to comply with Imperial directives and had begun broadcasting messages of defiance across local communication networks. "How is this possible?" Vexthul asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "My lord," Zefkol said carefully, "we believe the humans spent the past 6 weeks not only preparing for their own defense, but establishing contact with subject populations throughout Imperial territory." "Contact for what purpose?" "To teach them, my lord. To show them that resistance was possible, that Imperial authority was not absolute, and that some principles were worth dying for." The Emperor stared at the displays, showing rebellion spreading across his carefully maintained empire like a virus that infected the fundamental assumptions about power and authority that had kept trillions of beings in submission for centuries. "The humans knew they could not defeat my military forces," he realized aloud. "They never intended to win a conventional war. No, my lord. They intended to demonstrate something else entirely." As if summoned by his growing understanding, a new transmission began broadcasting across all Imperial communication networks. The signal was strong, clearly originating from multiple sources throughout the galaxy, and carried the unmistakable authority of careful preparation and absolute conviction. The image that appeared on every screen showed Admiral Sarah Chun, but not as she had appeared during the battle. This transmission had been recorded earlier, and she spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had already accepted the cost of her choices. "I am Admiral Sarah Chun of the human fleet," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the vast distances of Imperial space. "By the time you receive this message, the human military will have been destroyed, and our resistance to the cosmic dominion will appear to have ended." Emperor Vexthul leaned forward in his throne, his full attention focused on the words of a dead enemy who seemed to be addressing him directly from beyond the grave. "But what Emperor Vexthul does not understand," Chun continued, "is that some victories are more important than survival, and some words are more powerful than weapons." The transmission shifted to show scenes from across human territory: families boarding evacuation ships, children being taught to remember their names and history, entire populations relocating to hidden colonies in previously unexplored regions of space. The Emperor believes that power flows from the ability to destroy what others value. Chen's voice continued over images of human civilization, transforming itself into something that could not be conquered because it could not be found. He believes that fear is the ultimate weapon, and that sufficient terror can break any resistance. The images changed again, showing the faces of the Veltarian children who had died in the Emperor's demonstration of power. Each face was accompanied by a name, an age, and a brief description of their interests and dreams. But the Emperor has made a fundamental error in his understanding of human psychology. He has shown us something that we cannot accept, something that we cannot allow to continue, something that requires response regardless of the cost. Now the transmission showed recordings of human operatives making contact with oppressed populations throughout Imperial territory. Quiet conversations in hidden locations, teaching sessions where humans demonstrated techniques for resistance, and rebellion, coordination meetings where the foundations of a galactic uprising were carefully laid. "We cannot defeat the Emperor's military forces," Admiral Chen acknowledged. But we can do something more important. We can show the galaxy that his authority is not absolute, that his power is not unbreakable, and that there are still those who remember what it means to say no. The transmission reached its climax with scenes from the Battle of Kepler's Edge itself, but not the tactical details that the Emperor had focused on. Instead, it showed the moment when each human ship chose to fight to destruction rather than surrender, the collective decision to demonstrate that some principles were worth any price to defend. Emperor Vexthal, Admiral Chen said, now addressing him directly, "You have ruled through fear for 3,000 years. You have believed that sufficient cruelty could break any resistance, that overwhelming force could solve any problem, and that power was the only currency that mattered in the galaxy. Today, you learned something that no tyrant in human space has ever been able to ignore. You learned what happens when an entire species decides that something is unacceptable." The transmission began to fade, but Chen's final words echoed across imperial space with the clarity of absolute conviction. "You wanted to send a message to the galaxy about the nature of absolute authority. We have sent a different message about the nature of absolute refusal. The choice of which message the galaxy chooses to believe is no longer in your hands." The word you heard, Emperor, was no. Today you learned what that word means when spoken by humanity. Tomorrow, you will learn what it means when spoken by the galaxy itself. The transmission ended, leaving the throne room in the kind of silence that follows the witnessing of something that changes the fundamental nature of reality. Emperor Vexthal sat in his bone throne, surrounded by the artifacts of 3,000 years of conquest, watching his empire tear itself apart as species after species remembered that submission was a choice, not an inevitability. The reports continued to arrive. Uprisings on 40 worlds, supply line failures across entire sectors, garrison forces abandoning their posts rather than fire on civilian populations who had suddenly remembered that they outnumbered their oppressors by millions to one. "My lord," General Krixtal said quietly, "what are your orders?" Vexthal looked out at the stars that had once represented his domain, his authority, his absolute power over the destiny of trillions of beings. Now those same stars seemed to mock him with their infinite distance and their complete indifference to his will. "My orders, General?" The Emperor's voice carried a note of something that had never been heard in this chamber before: uncertainty. "My orders are to try to understand what has just happened to my empire. For 3,000 years, Emperor Vexthal had ruled through the assumption that power was the only force that mattered in the galaxy, that sufficient fear could control any population, and that those with superior weapons would always triumph over those with superior principles. A small species called humanity had just proven him wrong. They had not defeated his military forces. That would have been impossible given the disparity in numbers and technology. Instead, they had done something far more devastating. They had demonstrated that his entire philosophy of power was built on a foundation that could be shattered by a single word spoken with sufficient conviction. The humans had said no to his authority, and in dying for that refusal, they had shown the galaxy that such refusal was possible. Now, across the vast expanse of his empire, trillions of beings who had lived their entire lives in submission were learning to speak that same word. The children whose deaths had been meant to terrorize the galaxy into compliance had instead become the inspiration for the largest rebellion in galactic history. Emperor Vexthal, master of 47 star systems and ruler of the cosmic dominion, sat alone in his throne room and contemplated the possibility that some things really were more powerful than fear, more enduring than empires, and more terrifying than death itself. Somewhere in the hidden depths of space, the evacuated populations of humanity were building new homes among the stars, teaching their children the names of the Veltarian victims, and preparing to return to a galaxy that was learning, species by species, world by world, that the word no could indeed change everything. The Emperor had killed 5,731 children to demonstrate his power. He had heard a word that shook him to his core, and, in the end, he learned that hope was indeed more powerful than terror, that principle could triumph over force, and that sometimes the smallest voice really could topple the mightiest throne. The age of the cosmic dominion was ending, and the age of galactic freedom was about to begin. All because humanity had refused to accept that evil was permanent, and had been willing to pay any price to prove it.